This is a spoken summary of Frank Dicotter's book, The Cultural Revolution, A People's History, 1962 to 1976, published in 2016. It is the concluding volume of Dicotter's trilogy on Maoist China, following his earlier works on the founding years of the People's Republic and on the Great Famine. The book draws on party archives that were open to researchers only recently, together with memoirs, interviews, and self-published accounts by ordinary people. The author's central purpose is to tell the story of the Cultural Revolution not merely as a struggle among leaders in Beijing, but as it was experienced by the population at large, in the schools, the factories, the villages, and the labor camps. Dicotter's opening argument is that the Cultural Revolution had two faces that were inseparable. On one side stood a grand vision. Mao Zedong wished to become the pivot of world communism, and to guard China against what he called revisionism, the betrayal of revolution he associated with Nikita Khrushchev, who had denounced Stalin's cult of personality in 1956 and preached peaceful coexistence with the West. On the other side lay something far more personal and vengeful. After the catastrophe of the Great Leap Forward, in which tens of millions had starved, Mao feared that he would one day be treated as Khrushchev had treated the dead Stalin. The Cultural Revolution was his instrument to strike down his rivals before they could strike him. As Dikötter puts it, Mao saw no distinction between himself and the revolution. He was the revolution. The author opens with a telling anecdote. In August 1963, Mao received African guerrilla fighters in Beijing, and a visitor from southern Rhodesia asked whether the red star over Tiananmen Square might one day go out, as he believed it had in the Soviet Union. Mao answered that he could give no such guarantee, that he was searching very hard to keep China from becoming, in his words, corrupt, bureaucratic, and revisionist. Dikötter also states his conclusions at the outset. Over the 10 years of turmoil, he estimates, between 1.5 and 2 million people were killed, a figure far below the toll of the earlier famine, but immense nonetheless. And the deepest legacy, he argues, was unintended. Ordinary people, worn down by ideology and hunger, quietly dismantled the planned economy from below, dividing land, reviving markets, and running underground factories, so that in the end, in his memorable phrase, they buried Maoism, the scholar Ann Thurston, whom he cites, described the whole experience as one of loss, of culture, of status, of dignity, and of trust between people. Chapter 1. Two Dictators. The first chapter frames Mao as a conscious imitator of Stalin, a man competing to lead the socialist world. Its dramatic center is the 7,000 Cadres Conference of January 1962, held in the Great Hall of the People, the largest gathering the party had ever assembled. Mao's prestige was at its lowest point, because the famine that followed the Great Leap Forward, launched in 1958 with its people's communes and its slogans to catch up with Britain and overtake the United States, had killed, in Dicotter's estimate, at least 45 million people. The author traces Mao's long debt to Stalin from the land redistribution of the late 1940s that cost perhaps 1.5 to 2 million lives, through the forced collectivization of the mid-50s, to the shock of 1956, when Khrushchev's secret speech against Stalin struck Mao as a direct personal threat, since he too had built a cult around himself. Dikötter shows how Mao had already punished those who questioned him. When intellectuals were briefly invited to speak out in the 100 Flowers movement of 1957, Mao turned on them, and in the anti-rightist campaign that Deng Xiaoping helped run, some 500,000 people were labeled rightists, many deported to Manchuria and Xinjiang. The famine that followed the leap was accompanied by staggering violence in the villages, with victims beaten, branded, and buried alive by local cadres who had become, in the author's phrase, willing executioners. Dikötter records individual horrors, such as a man whose ear was chopped off and who was branded for the crime of digging up a potato, so that the reader grasps the human texture behind the statistics. At the conference, the head of state, Liu Shaoqi, delivered a bombshell. He called the disaster largely man-made, telling delegates that peasants in Hunan judged it 70% human error and 30% natural, directly contradicting Mao's insistence that the failures were merely one bad finger out of 10. Dikötter compares the scene to Stalin surviving the Congress of Victors in 1934, where delegates applauded even as many privately grumbled, and where over half were later shot or sent to the camps. Mao's countermove was subtle. Rather than lashing out, he posed as a benevolent elder, offered a token self-criticism, and drew out a chorus of confessions from other leaders that deflected blame away from himself. He had, too, a devoted flatterer in Lin Biao, the frail defense minister who had replaced Peng Dehuai, and who declared that whenever Chairman Mao's ideas were not respected, problems always followed. Mao survived the conference, but, the author stresses, he did not forget who had humiliated him. Where Stalin's brutality, in one historian's words, was as mechanical as a badger trap, Mao's genius was to keep power by turning society itself upside down. Chapter 2. Never Forget Class Struggle. Recovering from the famine, Mao reframed the catastrophe as the work of hidden class enemies. Borrowing Stalin's doctrine that class struggle intensifies as socialism deepens, a doctrine spread through Stalin's short course, which had circulated in tens of millions of copies and was studied, the author notes, almost like a Bible, he launched the Socialist Education Campaign. The chapter shows how this campaign served two purposes at once. It aimed to crush the private trade and household farming that had sprung up to survive the famine, and it allowed Mao to maneuver against Liu Shaoqi. Trying to prove himself the true and vigilant heir, Liu ran a purge even more vicious than Mao demanded, punishing over 5 million party members and hounding more than 77,000 people to death, most of whom were later cleared. Dikötter documents the shadow economy that radical collectivization had, paradoxically, produced. Thousands of private merchants operated in Xi'an, tens of thousands of entrepreneurs in Shenyang, and underground factories, transport, and construction flourished, while the opium trade revived from Heilongjiang to Shanxi. One survivor of the famine put the logic starkly: those who could not steal died. Those who managed to steal some food did not die. Investigators claim to find corruption everywhere. In parts of Hunan, up to 80% of rural cadres were declared corrupt. Liu's wife, Wang Guangmei, was sent under a false name to a village she called Peach Garden, where she pioneered a brutal interrogation posture known as the jet plane, in which victims were bent double with their arms wrenched up behind them. In one Gansu mining company, some 2,000 employees were interrogated, and 14 killed themselves. The confrontation between the two men sharpened. At a poolside meeting, Liu reportedly told Mao that so many people had died of hunger that history would judge them both, and that even cannibalism would go into the books. Mao replied that a third of the power in the country was no longer in the party's hands. When Khrushchev was deposed in October 1964, the parallel was not lost on Mao, and a Soviet official even suggested to a Chinese marshal that China too might get rid of its leader. Mao began to distance himself from Liu, muttering that someone was, in his coarse phrase, shitting on his head, and speaking of two independent kingdoms in Beijing. In January 1965, he rewrote the campaign's guidelines, and the crucial point was to rectify, in his words, those people in positions of authority within the party who take the capitalist road. That phrase would soon become the rallying cry of the Red Guards. Chapter 3. War on the Cultural Front. The third chapter turns to the battle over ideas, again modeled on Stalin's war against independent culture, in which writers were to be, in the Soviet phrase, engineers of human souls. Dikötter traces Mao's long record of crushing thought, from the Yan'an rectification of the 1940s, with its interrogations and mock executions, through the campaign against the writer Hu Feng, to the anti-rightist campaign. Mao once told the philosopher Liang Shuming that there were two ways of killing people, one with the gun and the other with the pen, and that the pen was the kind of murderer Liang was. The chapter details how the security specialist Kang Sheng, who had trained in Moscow and run the Yan'an persecutions, advanced the sinister theory that novels could be used for anti-party activity, calling it a great invention, a device that allowed writers to be accused of hidden treason. Two developments in particular prepared the cultural ground for revolution. The first was the cult of the soldier Lei Fang, a young man who died at 21, supposedly struck by a falling telephone pole, and whose diary was published across the country in 1963, full of worshipful devotion to Mao. Dikötter calls him a simplified Mao for the masses, and a string of similar model soldiers followed, one said to have thrown himself on a landmine to save his comrades. The second development was Lin Biao's promotion of Mao Zedong thought inside the army, which produced the Little Red Book, the compact volume of quotations that by 1965 existed in millions of copies, and would soon be brandished across the country like a revolutionary passport. Civil life was militarized, with school children firing air guns at portraits of Chiang Kai-shek, and summer camps enrolling tens of thousands of students. Mao also attacked the education system, likening examinations to the old imperial essay, praising students who dozed or cheated, and complaining that schools were failing to train revolutionary successors. He denounced the Ministry of Culture for being dominated by, in his phrase, gifted scholars, beautiful ladies, and foreign dead people. The chapter also records how, beneath the surface, old beliefs were reviving, with temples rebuilt, religious practice persisting in the countryside, and young people quietly turning away from the official creed. Finally, his wife Jiang Qing, a former Shanghai actress who, on marrying Mao, had promised to stay out of politics, was brought into cultural affairs through her old friend Kang Sheng. In February 1965, she was sent on a secret assignment to Shanghai. Culture, Dikötter writes, would become the stage from which the next revolution was launched. Chapter 4. Clique of Four. Against the backdrop of the Vietnam War and China's first atomic bomb, tested in October 1964, which made China the fifth nuclear power, Mao methodically removed four powerful men who stood in his way. They were the Army Chief of Staff Luo Ruxing, the head of the party's general office Yang Shangkun, the mayor of Beijing Peng Zhen, and the propaganda chief Lu Dengyi. Dikötter first sets the international scene, recalling that in the Korean War, China had sent some 3 million men and lost around 400,000, and that Mao now signaled, through the journalist Edgar Snow, that China would not send troops to Vietnam unless attacked directly. The fall of the four men followed one by one. Luo Ruiqing, who had clashed with Lin Biao over whether men or weapons mattered more in war, was accused of plotting for control of the army and subjected to struggle sessions. He attempted suicide by jumping from a window and broke his legs, prompting cruel jokes from Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, one of whom said he had dived like an ice lolly. Yang Shangkun fell after it emerged that party conferences, and even Mao's private flirtations, had been secretly tape-recorded. He was replaced by Wang Dongsheng, Mao's trusted bodyguard. Peng Zhen, the powerful mayor whose grip on the capital Mao complained was so tight one could not poke a hole in it with a needle, was the central target. The opening polemic of the whole Cultural Revolution was an essay attacking a historical play, The Dismissal of Hairui, written by the historian and deputy mayor Wu Han. Because the play concerned an upright official dismissed by an emperor, it could be read as a defense of the purged Peng Dehuai. The attacking article was drafted in Shanghai by Mao's new allies, the propagandist Zhang Chunqiao and the writer Yao Wenyuan, and revised 3 times by Mao himself before it appeared in November 1965. When Peng Zhen tried to protect the playwright and to treat the affair as a mere academic dispute, Mao sprang the trap, accusing him of running an independent kingdom and ordering the Beijing Municipal Party Committee dissolved. All 4 were declared an anti-party clique plotting a coup and were dismissed on the 23rd of May 1966. Lin Biao read out the accusations, calling the men fake revolutionaries and fake Marxists who, he warned, wanted to kill people, and Zhou Enlai endorsed the purge as a victory for Mao Zedong thought. Chapter 5. Poster Wars. The opening phase of the Cultural Revolution was fought with brush, ink, and paper. Mao used the People's Daily and the big character poster to unleash denunciation from the top, then deliberately withdrew and let his rivals blunder. Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, uncertain how to proceed while Mao remained evasive in the South, fell back on the old party method of sending in work teams. Following the playbook of earlier campaigns, those teams persecuted vast numbers of ordinary students and teachers, turning them into martyrs, which was precisely the pretext Mao needed to destroy Liu. Dikötter records the first ordinary victims with care. A 23-year-old worker walked 50 kilometers to a mountain near Nanjing and swallowed cyanide after a child glued a poster to his door. The eminent journalist Deng Tuo, denounced in the People's Daily as a traitor, took sleeping pills and died at home among his rare calligraphy. On the 1st of June 1966, an editorial titled, "Sweep Away All Monsters and Demons," opened the campaign publicly, and that evening a big character poster by a philosophy lecturer named Nie Yuanzi was broadcast nationwide, attacking the leadership of Peking University as revisionists. Mao called it more significant than the manifesto of the Paris Commune. Older teachers, remembering the anti-rightist campaign, sensed what was coming. One former rightist predicted it would be even worse than 1957. A new cultural revolution group was formed under Mao's ghostwriter Chen Boda, with Jiang Qing, Kang Sheng, Zhang Chunqiao, and Yao Wenyuan among its members, based at the Diaoyutai State Guesthouse. In the schools, students who had been raised on class struggle and the model of Lei Feng turned on their teachers with dunce caps, placards, the jet plane posture, and makeshift prisons called cowsheds. Dozens died in the province of Fujian alone within weeks. Following the logic of the 100 Flowers, Liu Shaoqi set a quota, ordering that 1% of students and teachers be denounced as rightists, which pointed toward some 300,000 victims nationwide. Within weeks, more than 10,000 students in the capital had been branded. At the number 17 cotton textile mill in Shanghai, a worker named Wang Hongwen, a future member of the Gang of Four, was labeled a self-seeking careerist for denouncing peace rates. By the time Mao returned to Beijing, Liu Shaoqi had become the most detested leader in the country. Chapter 6. Red August. Mao returned, destroyed Liu Shaoqi politically, dismantled the work teams, and unleashed the Red Guards. August 1966 became a month of state-sanctioned terror. The chapter opens with Mao's celebrated swim in the Yangtze in July, a piece of political theater designed to present the aging leader as vigorous, and it set off a nationwide craze for swimming. Back in Beijing, Mao demanded the work teams disband and forced Liu Endang into humiliating self-criticism. When Liu described himself as an old revolutionary facing new problems, Mao snorted that old counter-revolutionary was more like it. In his own poster, titled "Bombard the Headquarters," Mao accused unnamed leading comrades of imposing a white terror. Lin Biao was elevated to replace Liu as the number 2 and heir apparent, and the movement was guided by a document known as the 16 Articles, which handed real power to the Cultural Revolution Group. The Red Guards were born when Mao endorsed a student note with the words, "To rebel is justified." At first, they were dominated by the children of high officials, who embraced a doctrine of bloodline captured in a notorious couplet. If the father is a hero, the son is a hero. If the father is a reactionary, the son is a bastard. In Beijing, no more than 1 in 5 students qualified. The violence was appalling. The first killing Dikötter records is that of Bian Zhongyun, a deputy headmistress at a Beijing girls' school, who on the 5th of August was spat upon, had her mouth filled with soil, and was beaten to death with nail-studded clubs. Jiang Jing offered chilling encouragement, remarking that although the party did not advocate beating people, there was nothing so special about it, and that when bad people were beaten by good people, they deserved it. One young Red Guard, Zai Zhenhua, later confessed that her heart hardened and she whipped with an empty mind. On the 18th of August, at a rally of more than 1 million students on Tiananmen Square, a girl named Song Binbin pinned a Red Guard armband on Mao, who told her to be martial. The writer Lao Shi, author of Rickshaw Boy, was among the intellectuals beaten. His body was found in a lake the next day. In the rural county of Daxing, local cadres organized the extermination of more than 300 so-called bad elements, including an 8-year-old girl and her grandmother buried alive. And, as Dikötter notes, when the report reached the Cultural Revolution Group, nobody lifted a finger. The Minister of Public Security, Xi Fuji, told the police to support the Red Guards, saying that if in anger they beat someone to death, then so be it. By late September, at least 1,770 people had been killed in Beijing alone, and roughly 77,000 had been deported from the city to the countryside. Chapter 7. Destroying the Old World. The defining mission of the Red Guards became the annihilation of the 4 olds: old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits. This was a nationwide campaign of vandalism, house searches, and mass expropriation. An American resident named Sidney Rittenberg recalled, "Everything was smash, smash, smash. I could hardly believe what I heard." The Army newspaper cheered the Red Guards on, telling them that what they did was right and that they had done it well. In the streets, roving bands cut off long hair, slashed narrow trouser legs, and renamed roads. In Shanghai, the Bund became Revolutionary Boulevard. Dikötter piles up the cultural losses. In Shanghai, some 18 listed monuments were destroyed within days, including the tomb of the 17th century Christian scholar Shu Guangqi, and thousands of ancient scriptures were burned. Book bonfires rose 3 stories high, and the Jesuit library, founded in the 19th century with hundreds of thousands of volumes, was carted off to be pulped. Cemeteries were smashed on a vast scale, and across the country, tens of thousands of foreign graves were destroyed. At the hometown of Confucius, Red Guards from Beijing dug up tombs, while the leadership ordered that the main temple be preserved as a museum of class education. Flowers, caged birds, and pet cats were attacked as bourgeois indulgences. House searches, guided by lists from police and street committees, hunted for gold, foreign currency, portraits of Chiang Kai-shek, and old land deeds. The scale of confiscation was staggering. In the city of Wuhan, the loot included nearly a ton of gold and hundreds of thousands of silver dollars. Across one province, where only about 1% of households were raided, the seized assets ran to some 200 million yuan. In Shanghai, the figure reached 600 million. Much of the loot was simply stolen, and Dikötter argues that the biggest thieves were the Cultural Revolution group leaders themselves. Kang Sheng, whom he likens to Goring picking over looted art, amassed oracle bones, bronzes, and more than 12,000 rare books. What was not stolen was often left to rot in warehouses, with rare books stacked to the ceiling and eaten by vermin. Meanwhile, some 30,000 families in Shanghai were forced to surrender their homes, left with only a few square meters each, and at least 400,000 people were exiled from the cities. One official demanded of the businesswoman Nian Cheng whether it was right for her to live in a house of 9 rooms. Chapter 8. Mao Cult. Once the old world had been attacked, the only permitted new culture was the cult of Chairman Mao. Dikötter shows how the cult produced a gray uniformity, wrecked whole industries, and generated a frantic, paradoxically capitalist economy of Mao paraphernalia. Fashionable clothes and haircuts vanished, replaced by plain blue and gray cotton and proletarian short haircuts. Hawkers and peddlers were banned again, and whole trades collapsed. In Guangdong, some 20,000 people who had made incense and spirit money for a living lost their work, and outside one city, 1 in 5 survived on less than 3 yuan a month. Every product had to be purged of the feudal past, so that thousands of brand names and designs had to be scrapped, and the calligraphy of the fallen Liu Shaoqi had to be scrubbed from countless objects. The chapter is especially vivid on the badge economy. Mao badges, worn over the heart to individualize the drab uniforms, were produced in astonishing quantities. In Shanghai alone, dozens of factories turned out 15 million a month, and at the peak, Dikötter estimates, between 2 and 5 billion badges were made in all. So much aluminium was diverted from industry that in 1969 Mao himself intervened, demanding, "Give me back my aeroplanes." The demand for the Little Red Book consumed such quantities of paper and plastic that soap production was cut to compensate, and thousands of tons of plastic went into book covers. Even the pricing of plaster busts became a small drama of the plan against the market. The cult saturated the senses. Loudspeakers broadcast slogans and songs at full volume from dawn to night, an assault that one foreigner called a ceaseless inferno of sound that had, in his words, taught the population to hear without listening. Posters of Mao filled homes. The writer Anshi Min recalled filling her house with them to feel closer to him. The command economy could not satisfy the demand for cult objects, so black markets and speculation flourished even in the worship of Mao, with underground dealers stealing aluminium to feed the trade, and people barred from wearing a badge if they came from a bad class background. The fad for badges declined only after Lin Biao's death in 1971. Chapter 9. Linking Up. To spread the revolution beyond Beijing and to flush out capitalist roaders hiding in the provincial fiefdoms, Mao granted Red Guards the right to travel freely across the whole country, a practice called linking up. On the 5th of September 1966, the State Council announced free travel, free board, and free accommodation for all Red Guards. The result was a colossal, state-funded migration of youth that spread violence, factional warfare, disease, and enormous cost. Only students of good class background were supposed to qualify, and each carried a stamped letter of introduction. But many simply became free tourists, visiting revolutionary shrines such as Mao's birthplace at Shaoshan, the caves of Yan'an, and the Jinggang Mountains, where the first peasant Soviet had been founded, and where by December some 60,000 Red Guards were arriving each day. The trains became, in Dikötter's phrase, moving prisons, packed with young people squatting in aisles, lying on luggage racks, and crammed into overflowing lavatories, with boys cutting holes in the carriage floors. Beijing was overwhelmed, receiving some 3 million visitors on top of its permanent population of nearly 8 million, and the sanitation collapsed. One visitor said, even now she could still smell the latrines. In 8 rallies, the 2 largest on the 18th and 31st of August, Mao reviewed around 12 million Red Guards, and when the square could not hold them, he rode through the city in an open jeep. Most students were ecstatic. The writer Zhang Cheng caught only a glimpse of his back, but repeated the scripted line that she was the happiest person in the world. A rare dissenter, a young woman named Wang Rongfen, thought Lin Biao's rally speech resembled Hitler at Nuremberg, and wrote to Mao that the Cultural Revolution was not a mass movement, but, in her words, one man with a gun manipulating the people. She was arrested and imprisoned for 13 years. The venture ended badly. The final rally in November dissolved into a lethal stampede, as 2 million people rushed toward a single exit and a wooden bridge collapsed. And the free travel spread a meningitis epidemic through the crowded trains and dormitories that, Dikötter records, killed more than 160,000 people as medicine ran short and help came, in his words, too little and too late. Free board and travel were abolished in December 1966 after villagers and workers had begun to resent the young tourists eating and traveling at the state's expense. Chapter 10. Rebels and Royalists. In the autumn of 1966, the movement changed character. It shifted from an elite, bloodline-based affair, in which the children of officials attacked class scapegoats, into a broad rebellion from below, once the leadership redefined the targets as the party officials themselves. A red flag editorial in early October branded the capitalist roaders a small bunch of counter-revolutionaries, who, in its phrase, raised the red flag in order to fight the red flag. Chen Boda then named Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping as the main enemies, and demolished the bloodline theory as futile and against Mao Zedong thought. Overnight, the meaning of red and black inverted, and children of officials scrambled to protect their now suspect parents, while young people of ordinary or bad background became rebels. Dikötter explains the structural pressures behind the explosion. 17 years of broken promises since 1949, a rigid household registration system that split the population into privileged city dwellers and second-class peasants, an identity inherited through the mother, and the spread of insecure temporary labor had created what he likens to a pressure cooker. On the eve of the Cultural Revolution, about a third of all workers were temporary, without pensions or security, and after the famine, tens of millions of urban residents had been driven out to the countryside. Now workers who had been fired or sent down demanded redress, and their personal dossiers were dragged out and burned. On Mao's birthday, the 26th of December, Yang Qing met representatives of temporary workers and told them that the chairman was backing them, and Mao himself raised a toast, in his words, to the unfolding of a nationwide civil war. The chapter culminates in the January storm in Shanghai. There the rebel leader Wang Hongwen, from the cotton mill, built an organization of red workers, whom the mayor dismissed as the dregs of humanity. After a confrontation in which rebels lay down on railway tracks, refusing what they called revisionist food, the Shanghai radical Zhang Chunqiao flew in and granted them recognition. Huge battles followed between hundreds of thousands of rebels and a rival force of conservative Scarlet Guards. A bank run and panic buying gripped the city, which by New Year's Eve had less than a week's supply of grain and only days of coal, and on the 3rd of January 1967, the rebels seized the newspapers and the radio. Mao sent his congratulations, and the People's Daily hailed the January storm, urging the masses that if they had power, they had everything, and telling them to seize power. Chapter 11. Enter the Army. Because neither the Red Guards nor the worker rebels could actually unseat entrenched officials, Mao was forced to bring in the People's Liberation Army to support the left. But by letting the military decide who the true left was, he opened, in Dikötter's phrase, Pandora's box. Soldiers took over banks, prisons, granaries, and key bridges, and the old security apparatus built by Luo Ruiqing was smashed. Luo himself, unable to walk, was carried to a struggle session in a basket. In most places, the army suppressed the rebels as counter-revolutionaries. In the province of Qinghai, troops stormed a rebel-held newspaper and killed more than 100 people, including a small girl, in an assault lasting less than 20 minutes. The commander was at first congratulated. The intervention provoked a revolt by veteran marshals in February 1967, an episode later called the February Countercurrent. Old soldiers, such as Ye Jianying, Xu Shangjian, Tan Zhenlin, and the foreign minister Chen Yi, attacked the Cultural Revolution group to its face. Xu banged the table and demanded to know whether people like the student leader Kuai Dafu were now to lead the army, and Tan Zhenlin raged that the real aim was to purge all the old cadres. Mao crushed the revolt, threatening in what Kang Sheng called a proletarian rage to take to the mountains for guerrilla war and to have Chen Boda and Jiang Qing arrested if he continued to be opposed. Zhou Enlai bent with the wind, telling Jiang Qing that from then on she would make the decisions and he would carry them out. Meanwhile, Zhang Chengqiao had proclaimed a Shanghai People's Commune, modeled on Paris, but Mao objected that there had to be a party and a nucleus, and within weeks it was renamed a Revolutionary Committee, a 3-in-1 body of rebels, cadres, and officers that was in practice dominated by the army. Then Mao reversed course again to protect the rebels, limiting the army's power of arrest and reviving the slogan that to rebel is no crime. He also allowed the student Kuai Dafu to assemble 300,000 people to humiliate Liu Shaoqi's wife, Wang Guangmei, forcing her into the tight dress and high heels she had worn abroad. The result was escalating factional civil war, in which rival groups, and even divided army units, fought each other with improvised weapons, and then, in arms-producing regions like Sichuan, with grenades and mortars, as the writer Zhong Cheng watched corpses carried through the streets of Chengdu. Chapter 12. The Arms Race. The Wuhan incident of July 1967 marked the moment the revolution tipped into open armed warfare. In that city, a conservative alliance called the Million Heroes, backed by the regional commander Chen Zhaidao, seized and beat Wang Li, a member of the Cultural Revolution group who had come with Zhou Enlai while Mao was touring on his private train. Mao was hurried away to Shanghai by air. Lin Biao, who despised Chen Zhaidao, branded the affair a counter-revolutionary revolt, and the Cultural Revolution group answered with a slogan to take firm hold of the gun, calling for a handful of bad people to be dragged out of the army, just as they had been dragged out of the party. Lin declared that this was a revolution against the very people who had carried out the revolution. The effect was a nationwide arms race, as rebels stormed arsenals and looted arms shipments, some of them weapons destined for Vietnam that were seized in Guangxi. In Shanghai, Wang Hongwen led 100,000 workers to storm a diesel engine factory, leaving 18 dead, and Mao complimented him after watching the footage. Dikötter shows how the leaders manipulated this violence to settle personal scores, with Kang Sheng pursuing old enemies through fabricated cases such as the so-called Case of the 61 Traitors. The chapter also covers the unrest in Hong Kong in 1967, with its barricades, its slogans to stew the white-skinned pigs, and a bombing campaign in which some 8,000 devices were defused, and a radio presenter was burned alive in his car. The real target of many radicals, Dikötter reveals, was Zhou Enlai himself, who was protected only by Mao. Radicals dug up an old newspaper article to claim Zhou had once left the party, and though Mao forbade attacks on him, the accusation gave the radicals a weapon. The overreach came on the 22nd of August, when students, carrying petrol cans with, in the author's phrase, the happily expectant air of summer picnickers, set fire to the British diplomatic mission in Beijing, trapping the staff and subjecting them to a ritualized beating, pulling their heads back by the hair for photographs. This was too much. Mao declared the responsible radicals, including Wang Li, to be bad people, and ordered quietly that they be arrested and the matter handled by the premier, shifting power back toward Zhou Enlai. Chapter 13. Quenching the Fires. From late 1967 through 1968, Mao worked to extinguish the civil war he had lit. He protected the army with the phrase, "Save our Great Wall," scapegoated the radicals he had lately encouraged, and forced the creation of revolutionary committees everywhere through negotiation rather than violent seizure. Many exhausted people simply withdrew into private life, producing what Dikötter calls a miniature renaissance of forbidden reading, banned music, cards, and chess. Some quietly read a smuggled biography of Marie Curie or listened to Tchaikovsky. The Mao Cult, meanwhile, intensified as the party's own prestige waned. A campaign of 3 loyalties and 4 boundless loves brought loyalty dances, household shrines, and vast numbers of white plaster statues, with Shanghai alone holding more than 600,000 of them, consuming scarce metal and even dynamited ancient gates to make room. Yet the winding down produced some of the worst atrocities of the whole movement. In the province of Guangxi, the chapter documents massacres that killed as many as 80,000 people that summer, with severed heads displayed and, in one commune, dozens hammered to death. In the town of Wuxian, it records episodes of cannibalism in which victims of bad class background were butchered and eaten in a grotesque hierarchy, with leaders taking the heart and liver, while ordinary villagers pecked at the limbs. A local official later boasted that it was only the landlord's flesh and the spy's flesh. The author lets the horror stand largely without comment. When workers were finally sent to disarm the student Red Guards at Tsinghua University in Beijing and were fired upon, killing 5, Mao summoned the 5 student leaders to the Great Hall of the People and declared, "I am the Black Hand," adding that Kwai Dafu should have come to arrest him. He then sent a gift of mangoes, which had themselves been a gift from a foreign minister, to the worker teams occupying the campuses, a signal that the workers were now in charge, and this set off a wave of what became known as mangomania, with the fruit copied in wax and plastic, one preserved in formaldehyde, and workers buzzed in the cold to view it. On the 7th of September 1968, Zhou Enlai announced all-round victory, declaring that the whole country was now red. A month later, Liu Shaoqi was formally expelled from the party as a renegade, traitor, and scab. Chapter 14. Cleansing the Ranks. From the summer of 1968, the regime turned inward, launching a campaign to purge traitors, spies, and renegades from its own ranks. Unlike earlier purges, this one was carried out by the army-dominated revolutionary committees, which acted, in Dikötter's words, as judge, jury, and executioner, and which often used the campaign to settle local scores. The victims were overwhelmingly ordinary people, especially anyone with a foreign link or a bad class background. Mao endorsed the drive, praising one report as the best written material of its kind he had read. Dikötter marshals figures from across the country. In Shanghai, a city that before 1949 had held more foreigners than any city but New York, some 170,000 people were harassed, and more than 5,000 died, many by suicide, including musicians from the conservatory who leapt from tall buildings. In Beijing, the total of victims reached 100,000. Across more than 2,000 counties, the pattern repeated, with 100 or more people beaten to death or driven to suicide in the great majority of them, and around 40,000 unnatural deaths in Guangdong alone. In one Hebei county, about 1% of the population was locked up on the charge of belonging to a wholly invented party, and hundreds were hounded to death before the case was found to be fabricated. At one large labor camp, the records listed some 70 methods of torture. In the border and minority regions, the campaign escalated into something the author says looked like genocide. In Inner Mongolia, a hunt for former members of a Mongolian party, led by Kang Sheng and the public security minister Xie Fuji, swept up around 800,000 people with tortures of extreme cruelty, tongues torn out and eyes gouged, and killed, by estimate, between 16 and 23,000, most of them Mongols, though they were under a tenth of the population. The Mongolian language itself was banned from publications. In Yunnan, the persecution of a supposed hidden traitor brought 17,000 deaths. One local slogan captured the spirit of the whole campaign: kill a batch, arrest a batch, and handle a batch. Chapter 15. Up the mountains, down to the villages. Mao's decree that urban students be re-educated by the peasants exiled millions to the countryside from December 1968 onward. The People's Daily told the young that they had 2 hands and should not laze about in the city. The exile was meant to be permanent, and students had to surrender their urban residence cards, so that some resisted by feigning illness or doctoring their papers, and one rebel vowed he would go only dead on a stretcher. Those who went arrived into destitution, hunger, disease, and, for girls, widespread sexual abuse. Dikötter documents housing shortages so severe that students lived in caves, temples, and pigsties, and hunger so common that in some regions the great majority of exiled youths went short of food. In one region, 83% went hungry. In the far north, temperatures fell to 40 below, and 9 of 10 female students suffered menstrual problems. The sexual abuse was extensive. In one Hubei county alone, over 200 young women were, in the records, languaged, molested, raped, or otherwise destroyed, some as young as 14. A vice premier, Li Shanian, reading such reports, wondered aloud how many other counties were the same, and estimated that in Hubei alone, the true figure might reach 8,000 women. In 1973, prompted by a letter from a schoolteacher named Li Qinglin, Mao sent a small sum of money and ordered the problem addressed, but the practice continued. One young student wrote that he had become a mere beast, working only to eat. Over the years from 1962 to 1978, Dikötter estimates some 18 to 20 million students were banished. This youth exile, moreover, was only one strand of a much larger permanent depopulation of the cities, which also swept out ordinary undesirables, retired and sick workers sent away without pensions, and whole families. In smaller cities, the number of ordinary exiles could exceed that of the students by 2 to 1, most of them left to survive on a starvation ration of grain. Disgraced officials, meanwhile, were sent to what were called May 7th cadre schools, run on military lines, where they did hard manual labor side by side with their former enemies. Some, the author notes, were almost relieved to escape the struggle sessions of the cities. Chapter 16. Preparing for War. In 1969, border clashes with the Soviet Union, deliberately provoked by China at Zhenbao Island on the Ussuri River in March, brought the two nuclear powers to the brink of war. Zhou Enlai directed the operation, and Mao halted it once its purpose was served, saying they should stop and fight no more. The aim was to put the Soviet Union on notice and to heighten tension at home, and Mao called on the country to prepare for a great war, an early war, and even a nuclear war. The Ninth Party Congress that spring reversed the earlier Congress that had dropped Mao Zedong thought, confirmed Lin Biao as Mao's successor in the Constitution, and filled the Central Committee with military men. The war scare set off a mania of shelter digging and evacuation. In October, after a further Soviet strike in Xinjiang that wiped out a Chinese squadron, Lin Biao issued an urgent order moving 1 million soldiers, thousands of planes, and hundreds of ships, and the leaders scattered from the capital, though in the end nothing happened. Beijing built an underground city covering some 85 square kilometers, with clinics and even a roller skating rink, and cities across the country dug tunnels and set brick quotas, at great cost and with frequent, sometimes fatal accidents when kilns exploded. The war never came, and the tunnels were later blocked up. The chapter's larger subject is the Third Front, the vast relocation of heavy industry into the mountainous interior, centered on the province of Sichuan, driven by the lesson Mao drew from the German invasion of the Soviet Union. He poured resources into projects like the Panzhihua Iron and Steel Complex, even donating the royalties from the Little Red Book, and declared that he could not sleep until it was built. Dikötter judges the whole enterprise a colossal waste. Around 1,800 factories were set up in the hinterland, many never finished. One steel mill was redesigned 6 times and produced steel only after 27 years. Roughly 2/3 of state industrial investment in these years went to the Third Front, in what he calls probably the biggest example of wasteful capital allocation made by any one-party state in the 20th century, an economic disaster second only to the Great Leap Forward. Chapter 17. Learning from Dazhai. Dazhai was a model farming brigade on the lowest plateau of Shanxi, promoted through the slogan "In agriculture, learn from Dazhai," and it became the defining agricultural policy of the era, guiding the countryside for some 15 years. Its leader, an illiterate villager named Chen Yonggi, who wore a white terrycloth turban, was celebrated for rebuilding his flooded village while refusing all state grain, funds, and relief, a principle summed up as the 3 no's. Dikötter argues that the emulation of Dazhai was in effect a return to the Great Leap Forward, forced recollectivization, a grain-first monoculture, and grandiose projects to make man conquer nature. It was also, he writes, a gigantic exercise in deception, because Dazhai's miracle harvests were faked and inflated, the irrigation works were built by the army, and the brigade was secretly propped up by state subsidies. By 1968, more than 1 million people had trooped through it on pilgrimage. The chapter also records how the countryside, largely bypassed by the early urban violence, briefly reclaimed its freedoms. As the state seemed to melt away, villagers reopened markets, doubled their private plots, and in some places abandoned the communes altogether. In one survey of 30 counties, 2/3 of markets were unsupervised. Yet, in the villages nearest the cities, railways, and roads, there were also terrible killings. At Daoxian, in Hunan, close to 5,000 people of bad class background were butchered, some of them infants. Mao's attitude to grain shifted with circumstances. Unable to force the peasants to hand over hidden harvests, he reasoned that when they concealed the grain, they were simply storing the wealth among the people, and the state then reduced the grain it sold back to the countryside, in keeping with the doctrine of self-reliance. From 1968, the army imposed the Dazhai model. Private plots were seized, sideline occupations banned, and resistance expressed itself in the mass slaughter of pigs, so that in parts of Hunan, in the author's phrase, every courtyard became a slaughterhouse and every man's hands were bloody. Under the slogan to take grain as the key link, fruit trees and tea bushes were cut down, and grasslands and lakes were converted to grain fields, even hills built on flat land just to be terraced. The environmental damage was severe. Terraces eroded, pastures turned to desert, and hundreds of lakes vanished. At one great lake in Yunnan, hundreds of thousands were mobilized to fill in the wetlands, and the fish catch collapsed over the following decade. As one villager summed it up, learning from Dazhai was the continuation of the Great Leap Forward. Chapter 18. More Purges. After the campaign to cleanse the ranks, new purges targeted a younger generation. First, through a largely fictitious conspiracy called the May 16th Group, named after the circular that had launched the Cultural Revolution, and then through an even broader and deliberately vague campaign known as One Strike and Three Antis. Millions were implicated on trumped-up charges, most of them ordinary people. Dictators' central argument here is that the purpose was not physical extermination, but intimidation, the aim being, in his words, to produce a docile population by transforming almost every act and every utterance into a potential crime. The chapter records the lonely death of Liu Shaoqi in November 1969, a month after his expulsion from the party. In solitary detention, his body wasted and denied his diabetes medicine. Zhou Enlai, put in charge of the matter, denounced him as a criminal traitor and toasted the completion of the task after the secret cremation under a false name. The scale of the new campaigns was immense. In the province of Hubei, the total reached some 736,000 cases, roughly 1 person in 50. In Gansu, similar proportions, with 250,000 people denounced in the first 3 months, and 45 suicides in a single county in under a month. The three Antis, aimed at corruption, speculation, and waste, all of them left undefined, functioned as the enforcement arm against any private economic activity outside the plan. In Hubei, nearly 500,000 of the victims were charged with economic crimes. Executions, however, were relatively few, which is the key to Dikötter's point about the campaign's logic. In Gansu, he notes, only just over 200 people had been shot by one stage of the campaign, while 7 times as many killed themselves. Doctors were arrested for such offenses as listening to foreign radio years earlier, liking freedom, or singing a reactionary song, so that in one town, the main hospital nearly closed for lack of staff. If the worst provinces were at all representative, the author suggests, something like 16 million people may have been denounced across the country, a vast exercise less in killing than in fear, and one man defiantly told his persecutors that he could be stubborn for as many years as they cared to hold their sessions. Chapter 19. Fall of an Heir. Mao systematically undermined and destroyed his own designated successor, Lin Biao. The struggle turned on the vacant office of head of state and on the emerging opening to the United States. Mao, who loathed ceremonial duties, dangled the post to test whether Lin coveted it, and grew suspicious after Lin issued an order in October 1969 that moved 1 million soldiers without his clearance. At a Central Committee meeting in the summer of 1970, When Lin and his generals pressed for a state chairmanship and for the constitution to praise Mao as a genius, Mao sprang a trap. He spared Lin but denounced his ally, Chen Boda, his old ghostwriter, as a sham Marxist and a spy, and Chen's fall was the first sign that Lin's own position was crumbling. Around this same period, Mao played the American card. He had the journalist Edgar Snow stand beside him on the rostrum, received an American ping-pong team in what became known as ping-pong diplomacy, and hosted a secret visit by Henry Kissinger, who offered recognition, help with the United Nations seat, and even intelligence on the Soviet Union, and asked for little in return. Mao gloated that the United States was, in his image, changing from monkey to man, though the tail was still there. For ordinary people, the softening treatment of foreigners, the reopening of the Forbidden City, and the removal of some Mao portraits were fragile signs of hope. The businesswoman Nian Cheng thought it almost too good to be true. The relationship between Mao and Lin then broke down completely. Mao fell ill with pneumonia and darkly suspected that Lin wanted his lungs to rot. In August 1971, he toured the South, meeting commanders and obliquely warning them against a man who claimed that genius appears only once in centuries. According to the account Dikötter follows, a half-baked plot by Lin's 25-year-old son, involving flamethrowers and a plan to bomb Mao's train, collapsed when Lin's own daughter alerted the guards, and on the 13th of September 1971, Lin Biao, his wife and his son, died when their plane, short of fuel and without a full crew, crashed in Mongolia as they fled toward the Soviet Union. The Lin Biao affair shattered popular faith in Mao's infallibility. As one young man put it, the pillar of spiritual certainty had crumbled, and his faith in communism and in Mao had collapsed. Many felt an almost audible sigh of relief, and for them this was the beginning of the end of the Cultural Revolution. Chapter 20. Recovery. After the shock of the Lin Biao affair, the regime staged a cosmetic recovery. Veteran officials were rehabilitated, cities were scrubbed clean for President Nixon's visit in February 1972, and the rhetoric softened. Mao reconciled with the old marshals, attending the funeral of Chen Yi in a silk robe, and admitting of the purged Chief of Staff Luo Ruiqing that he had been imprudent to listen so often to Lin Biao's one-sided views. In Shanghai, more paint was used in a few weeks than in the previous 22 years. The diplomatic breakthrough with the United States carried enormous propaganda value at home, presented as an American admission of defeat. The North Korean leader was reported to have said that Nixon came to Beijing waving the white flag. But Dikötter's argument is that the recovery was only skin deep. When the army returned to barracks in 1972, the rehabilitated capitalist roaders came back to run a planned economy that remained moribund, with widespread deficits, low productivity, and shoddy goods. In some provinces, a third or even half of manufactured products were faulty, and workers stole time, played cards, and pilfered, with the resigned attitude, as freight handlers in Hankou put it, that the management did not care, and neither did they. By the mid-70s, one enterprise in four was running at a loss. Consumer shortages were acute, down to soap, matches, batteries, and toothbrushes. In one region, a single bar of soap was shared by 3 people for a season, and outside Nanjing, many people began using toothbrushes only after Mao's death. Most strikingly, famine persisted into the mid-1970s. Dikötter describes an inspector in a Shanxi county in December 1973 finding a family of 7 sleeping on frozen earth in a shed, with an old man begging the government to take care of them. In one commune, 50 people had starved to death that spring. At Mao's death, the author estimates, at least a fifth of the population, some 200 million people, suffered chronic malnutrition. The health system had collapsed as well. The celebrated barefoot doctors, sometimes given as little as 10 days of training, were, in his assessment, largely a sham that shifted costs from the state onto the villages, and cooperative medicine was abandoned by many communes. Real improvement, he argues, came only after the communes were finally dissolved. Chapter 21. The Silent Revolution. This chapter is the heart of Dikötter's larger thesis. As the military dictatorship weakened after Lin Biao's death, ordinary villagers and local cadres quietly subverted the planned economy from below, driven both by destitution and by opportunity. They reclaimed land, revived black markets, ran underground factories, and migrated in defiance of the household registration system. The author calls this the silent revolution, at first uneven and scattered, but eventually engulfing the whole country and prefiguring the reforms of the 1980s. The examples are pointed. Even at Yan'an, the sacred shrine of communist self-sacrifice, a propaganda team in 1974 found a thriving and sophisticated black market, with one village abandoning farming to sell pork and buying back corn to meet its grain quota, all under the eye of the local cadres. Across Shanxi, whole communes divided their assets and returned production to families, preserving the fiction of collective ownership by handing over a percentage of the crop. In one place, it was reported, not a single party meeting had been called, and not one prescribed work of Marx, Lenin, or Mao had been studied. Cadres who had been humiliated in struggle sessions lost interest in politics and turned their energies to production and to letting the markets thrive. In one Hunan village, a self-reliant private farmer prospered, while a loyal collectivist lived in rags in a converted latrine. A socialist world, the author observes, turned upside down. In the wealthier coastal regions, people went into business by choice as much as by need. In one Zhejiang county, of 250,000 people, 2/3 of households had gone it alone by late 1971. In Guangdong, open markets sold goods that were supposed to be state monopolies, sometimes at prices many times the official rate. Overseas remittances revived in the emigrant counties, with parcels of clothes and oil piling up by the hundreds of thousands, and rural factories multiplied, some villages turning almost entirely to making nails or embroidery for wages that dwarfed a farmer's collective earnings. As the sociologist Fei Xiaotong observed, peasants did not mind what the nature of ownership was. The only thing they minded was to keep up their livelihood. Migration surged as well, with vast numbers traveling without tickets and settling in the cities or in Manchuria without permission. This, Dikötter argues, not any policy from Beijing, was the real engine of the change to come. Chapter 22. The Second Society. Alongside this second economy, there survived what Dikötter calls a second society, an underground realm of forbidden reading, secret radio listening, clandestine art, music, religion, folk culture, and above all, the resilient family. His central claim is that despite its totalizing ambitions, the Cultural Revolution ran no more than skin deep. It exacted outward compliance while private beliefs endured. People, he writes, fought deception with deception and lies with lies, many of them keeping two minds, one public and one private. The chapter surveys the wreckage of the education system, with schools closed or half empty, standards collapsing so far that children could not name when the republic was founded or place Beijing on a map, and illiteracy climbing, until, by the late 1970s, the state itself admitted that 1/3 to 1/2 of the young could barely read or write. Yet against this ran a paradoxical flourishing of forbidden reading, as books looted by Red Guards circulated on the black market and translations meant only for officials leaked out. The titles named range from Solzhenitsyn and Schirrer to Salinger, Camus, and Kerouac, copied by hand and passed among secret reading circles, with the most politically dangerous and the most erotic fetching the highest prices. People built transistor radios to hear broadcasts from Moscow, Taiwan, and the West, even as the state, ironically, cut the price of radios to spread Mao's thought. Underground painters, such as the Beijing group that called itself the Nameless, worked quietly outside politics, hiding in the very act of painting the chairman. Religion persisted in private homes, with Christians in Hebei declaring that they believed not in Mao but in God, and folk opera, festivals, geomancers, and spirit mediums continued in the villages, despite Jiang Qing's 8 model dramas. Above all, Dikötter emphasizes the endurance of the family. Unlike the Soviet cult of the child who informs on his parents, denunciations of close relatives in China were rare, and those who made them were shunned and even confined. He recounts the extreme and singular case of a 15-year-old boy who denounced his own mother and demanded her death for burning portraits of Mao. She was shot, and he spent the rest of his life in remorse, the only known case of a son demanding a relative's execution. Homes, the author writes, became fragile islands of freedom. Chapter 23. Reversals. The post-Lin Biao thaw was followed by a freeze. Fearing that the criticism of Lin was undermining his own legacy, Mao unleashed a series of radical campaigns, including one to criticize Lin Biao and Confucius, that was aimed obliquely at Zhou Enlai, cast as a modern-day Confucius. He played the radical group later known as the Gang of Four, his wife Jiang Qing, together with Zhang Chungqiao, Yao Wenyuan, and the risen Shanghai rebel Wang Hongwen, against the veteran administrators Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping. Zhao, stricken with bladder cancer and denied timely treatment on Mao's instructions, nonetheless used his last strength to call for the four modernizations of agriculture, industry, defense, and science, and the pragmatic Deng Xiaoping was restored as vice premier to get the economy and the paralyzed railways moving, jailing looters and disciplining slack steel plants. On Deng's order, the army also crushed a Muslim county in Yunnan that had demanded religious freedom, killing more than 1,600 people. Jiang Qing, meanwhile, developed imperial pretensions, comparing herself to the Tang Empress Wu Zetian, having imperial gowns tailored, and even mounting guns on the roof of her residence, until Mao warned her against forming a gang. Mao's own health was failing from a wasting neurological disease that left his mind intact but his body collapsing, so that he could communicate only through the attendant Zhang Yufeng. He offered his verdict on the Cultural Revolution as 70% success and 30% failure, and he demanded that Deng affirm it, but Deng refused, which was a direct affront. In response, a new campaign was launched to oppose the rightist wind of reversing verdicts, egged on by Mao's nephew, who whispered that Deng rarely praised the Cultural Revolution. When Zhou Enlai died in January 1976, the outpouring of public grief alarmed the radicals, who tried to forbid mourning, yet tens of thousands lined the icy streets, and a foreign witness said he had never seen such universal grief. At the Qingming festival in April, hundreds of thousands gathered at the monument to the people's heroes in Beijing to mourn Zhu and to attack the Gang of Four in coded poems, in what became known as the Tiananmen Incident. The authorities cleared the square by force, arresting and beating hundreds, and Jiang Qing, watching through binoculars from the Great Hall, later toasted, "We are victorious." Dong was purged again and blamed for the affair, but the event revealed how far the regime had lost its legitimacy, as the country waited, more or less openly, for Mao to die. Chapter 24. Aftermath. The final chapter opens with the Tangshan earthquake of the 28th of July, 1976, which killed at least 500,000 people and leveled a great coal city, a catastrophe that, in traditional belief, foretold the fall of a dynasty. The response was telling. Seismologists had predicted such a quake, but lacked the staff and equipment after years of upheaval. Some neighborhood committees urged survivors to go on criticizing Deng Xiaoping, and the acting leader, Hua Guofeng, rejected all foreign aid to assert national self-confidence. Mao himself died just after midnight on the 9th of September. Dikötter stresses the muted, often relieved reaction. Among students at Peking University, one witness recalled, there were no gasps or tears, only a sense of relief. And in the countryside, an Anhui villager said, not a single person wept. Many had to perform a grief they did not feel, one man weeping in public by day after quietly opening his only bottle of wine the night before. Less than a month after Mao's death, Hua Guofeng, backed by Marshal Ye Jianying and Mao's former security chief Wang Dongxing, had the Gang of Four arrested one by one. The public celebrated so freely that stores sold out of liquor, and the gang became convenient scapegoats for the whole decade. At their trial in 1980, Jiang Qing was defiant, declaring, I was Chairman Mao's dog. I bit whomever he asked me to bite. Deng Xiaoping soon outmaneuvered the colorless Hua, who had tried and failed to build a cult of his own, and by the end of the decade, Deng was the paramount leader, tolerating and then suppressing the brief flowering of the democracy wall, where an electrician named Wei Jingsheng had called for democracy as a fifth modernization before being jailed. But Dikötter's closing argument is that the decisive change came not from the leaders, but from below. The party's official resolution of 1981 blamed Lin Biao and the Gang of Four and largely absolved Mao, applying to him his own formula of 70% right and 30% wrong. The economic reforms, when they came, were introduced reluctantly and often looked backward, even trying at first to push villagers back into the communes. What really transformed the country was the silent revolution of the previous decade, the accumulated actions of villagers who had already made collectivization irrelevant. As one scholar quoted by the author puts it, The government lifted restrictions only in recognition that the sea of unorganized farmers had already made them pointless. The people's communes were dissolved in the winter of 1982 to 83. If there was a great architect of economic reform, Dikötter concludes, it was the people. Closing synthesis. Stepping back, Dikötter's people's history makes a sustained case with several intertwined threads. The Cultural Revolution was at once Mao Zedong's bid to secure his place in history against the fate that had befallen Stalin, and a decade-long convulsion of purges, factional warfare, cultural destruction, and economic waste that reached into every corner of Chinese society, from the schools of Beijing to the villages of Guangxi. Its human cost, by the author's accounting, was between 1.5 and 2 million people killed, alongside countless more persecuted, exiled, tortured, and starved, in a country where malnutrition remained widespread to the very end. Yet, the movement's most enduring result, Dikötter argues, was the opposite of what Mao intended. By discrediting the party's ideology, by shattering the population's faith in the infallible leader after the Lin Biao affair, and by driving ordinary people to fend for themselves through black markets and quiet decollectivization, the Cultural Revolution hollowed out Maoism from within. The planned economy was abandoned in the villages long before it was ever reformed in Beijing. In seeking to destroy the old world in the name of permanent revolution, the movement in effect buried Maoism, and it left behind a party that would afterwards rule, as the author observes of the decades that followed, not by belief but by force, a lesson he traces forward to the crushing of the democracy protests in 1989.